Hello and welcome to our first talk on St. Ignatius of Loyola and his spirituality or way of proceeding, taken from the spiritual exercises of Ignatius. On this, as we begin the Novena of St. Ignatius today, in preparation for his feast on July 31st. A bit of biographical facts of St. Ignatius. St. Ignatius was born in 1491 in the northern part of Spain, in Loyola. This part of Spain was, or remains to this day, the Basque country. That even though his family sided with Spain, they weren't, if you will, technically Spanish, but rather they were Basques, as was St. Francis Xavier, although his family sided with the French crown. St. Ignatius, in his spiritual autobiography, he admits that until the age of 28, that he was a man given up to the vanities of the world. That is, for St. Ignatius, appearances definitely mattered. Riches and honor definitely mattered. And so then he spent his energy, his time, his concentration on seeking to win glory for himself, that he would make indeed a great reputation within the kingdom of Spain. And so then, as a young man in his 20s, he served in the court of some duke over there. And it was in 1521, during the Battle of Pamplona, again in the north of Spain, that St. Ignatius was wounded. And a consequence of this wound, of being sort of having a cannonball deflected off his leg, that his leg was broken. And so then, back then, there were no casts as we have today, but rather he would have to lie still in his bed in traction. That is, he was carried in a litter back from Pamplona to Loyola, and in the small, very small family castle, then he was given a bed for his recovery. And so the doctor set the leg, then bound it and put it in traction. And so Ignatius, at this time, he was bored. There was no television or radio or internet or anything like that. He was bored. And so he asked his sister for, in a sense, books on sort of knightly tales or romantic novels centered around the actions of a knight. And so St. Ignatius' sister had none of those books, but only sort of religious books. She had the Bible, the lives of the saints. And so she gave these to Ignatius. Ignatius began to read them, not initially because it was something that he was attracted to, but rather it was to break the boredom. And Ignatius then, with nothing to do, he practiced his imagination. And he says in his autobiography, he says, I imagine doing great things in the eyes of the world. Maybe that I would lead this army, or I'd be the hero in some military campaign. And all would revere me, all would have such a positive impression of me. So I would win glory in the eyes of the world. And Ignatius, after daydreaming for hours, he said that when he finished his daydream, in glory in the eyes of the world, he said, I felt good, I felt fired up, I felt excited, enthusiastic. But he said that enthusiasm, that excitement, that vitality of doing great things in the eyes of the world, that it would leave him, it would dissipate. It would become less strong in him. And because of what he was reading, the Bible and the lives of the saints, or other spiritual books, Ignatius began to daydream about doing great things for God. No longer great things of Assisi did, or St. Dominic or other saints. He would think to himself, well, if they did this, so too could I do that. But maybe for Ignatius, he thought, I could do even more. And so then, imagining, daydreaming about doing great things for God, when he finished his daydream, Ignatius realized that he felt the same feelings that he felt when he imagined doing great things in the eyes of the world. He felt great excitement, great enthusiasm, great vitality. But little by little, day by day, he began to realize a difference. And the difference for Ignatius was that those feelings of that enthusiasm, that excitement, that generosity, that selflessness, that vitality, that, unlike doing great things in the eyes of the world, doing great things for God, those feelings didn't leave him, but rather they remained just as strong. And so Ignatius then, in a very basic discernment, that he discerned the idea that maybe God had different plans for him, that God had a will for him that was not to seek glory in the eyes of the world, but rather do great things for God. And so then at the conclusion of this basic discernment, Ignatius then left his family's home after those months of recovery, and he walked to a Benedictine monastery, and at that monastery he had an all-night vigil before the statue of Our Lady of Montserrat. And at the end of that all-night vigil, he placed his sword there as a symbol that he no longer seek glory in the eyes of the world, but rather he would dedicate himself to doing great things for God, though that remained in a way unarticulated in terms of the details, what that meant. And then Ignatius found a beggar, and he gave to the beggar all his expensive clothing with their ornate design. And Ignatius took from the beggar his beggar's robe, and then he hit the road. And so in these early times of the conversion of Ignatius, that his idea of doing great things for God, that for him it just meant seeing what St. Francis did, or St. Dominic, or some other saint. And he would then seek to imitate their actions, but maybe doing even more. And so St. of Assisi was a great ascetic. Ignatius says, well, I too then will become a great ascetic. That Ignatius, who had been given up to the vanities of the world, he no longer cut or combed his hair or washed it. He no longer cut his nails. Imagine how long they grew, or his toenails. And so then he neglected his own hygiene. He ate extremely little. Whatever he begged, he would then give that food to the poor. And he would just eat something much, much less. And so he neglected his body, sleeping little, eating to severe asceticism, to punish his body for his previous sinfulness. It's interesting that in these early days of his conversion, even though he wants to do great things now in the eyes of God, where is Ignatius's focus? His focus isn't so much on God or on pleasing God, but rather it remains on himself. What are those great actions that I will do? The heavenly cord now substitutes for the eyes of the world. Francis was a great ascetic. I will be even a greater ascetic. Again, for Ignatius in these early days, the focus was still on himself. You compare this way of proceeding in those early days of Ignatius's conversion, and you fast forward to the principle and foundation of the spiritual exercises. That in that principle and foundation, Ignatius taught that the human being is created to praise, greater glory of God. How did Ignatius go from being still so focused on himself, even those early days of his conversion, to now speaking of the greater glory, not of himself, but of God? No longer the glory of being the harshest ascetic, or the one who sleeps the less, or the one who keeps the worst hygiene. The focus now is on service of God, praising and reverencing Him, of serving God's glory. And what then is God's glory? Glory is God's goodness, says the Church. God's goodness, God's love, God's majesty. And so by praise, reverence, and service, Ignatius gives praise and reverence and service to God's goodness, to God's majesty, to God's love. That he uses himself to make manifest, to make clear God's goodness in the eyes of the world, of God's love and majesty in the eyes of the world. No longer focused on himself, even after his conversion. But now he was a person given entirely over to God's service, for God's use, to reverence, worship, praise. And so the question then is, how did Ignatius go from point A, focusing on himself, to point B, given over to the praise, reverence, and service of God, for God's greater glory, not his own, but God's greater glory? For me, we look to the spiritual exercises and that first week of the exercises. If you just take that manual out and you read it, what you will read is you will read a lot of words and ideas and prayers surrounding sinfulness, the sin of the angels who fell from heaven, the sin of the first parents of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, the sinfulness of the world, and the sinfulness of oneself. He said it's like this scab on our skin that just doesn't seem to heal, but the pus oozes out. But at the same time, in that first part of the exercises, Ignatius speaks then, after contemplating or meditating on sinfulness. He then has this beautiful passage when he speaks of a cry of wonder. How is it that the angels haven't struck him down by the sword of God's justice? How is it that the saints in heaven pray and intercede for me, although clearly I'm just a lost cause? And how is it that God has made this beautiful creation that nurtures and sustains in life? How is it that the earth doesn't open up and swallow me whole for all that I've done? All my unworthiness, all my sinfulness. Ignatius says it is a cry of wonder. And for me, the cry of wonder is the experience in faith of this engine, if you will. This engine that drives this spirituality or prayer of St. Ignatius of Loyola. That little engine, or what drives this form of prayer, is the experience of mercy, the experience of a merciful love. Yes, the angels and archangels should strike me down. Yes, the saints should close their ears to my pleas. Yes, the earth should open up and swallow me whole. But the cry of wonder is that the reality is the opposite. The saints pray and intercede for me. The angels guard and protect me. The earth sustains me in life. And most importantly, transcendently so. And God gives everything. Everything he has. And so the cry of wonder is the beginning of a realization, the beginning of an awareness that I've been duped by lies. I'm not just the failure. I'm not just a project that needs to be done over. I'm not just a sinner, but I'm a beloved sinner. But I'm the apple of God's eye. Worthless, but rather for God we are everything. We each individually are everything to him because we have the eyes to see and the ears to hear. And so what drives us to praise, reverence, and serve? What drives us to say, not my glory, but your glory, God? It's not just a change in our thoughts, but it's a change in our hearts too. That awareness from the experience of a personal love, a personal experience of God's mercy. And so life's not such a mystery after all, that we are created to praise, reverence, and serve God our Lord. And that all things are for his glory. My praise is for him. My reverence is for him. My service is for him. Not because I'm an altruistic person, but because it is what he has done first. God bless, and see you next time.